After World War II, there were many tensions between the two military powerhouses at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. There were nuclear tensions between the countries as they were on the verge of a full-scale nuclear war. The general population was constantly waiting in fear, ready for the first strike to come.
I remember the late 1970s and early 80s. I have the nightmare every week. I can see myself as a youngster. I remember when in my 7th grade class, Mr. C, he told me, "Mr. Nedrich, you need to get out there and get in the gymnasium for the bomb drill." And I'm like, "Bomb drill? Wow. Are we getting bombed?" And I was frightened because I'd seen these pictures of nuclear bombs going off everywhere. And I was frightened as a young kid. And we would go into the gymnasium, we'd all be in there, and I'm thinking, wow, over 90,000 people died. And look, we got 100 people in here, they're all dying. So I remember that. And I remember the Olympic Games, and I remember us, the Americans, boycotting the Olympic Games, and then the Russians boycotting the Olympic Games because we were involved, and it was very contentious. And I remember those bomb drills. My friends would go in their yard. We had bomb shelters in their yard, and there was big metal containers. They'd go down in them, and I was like, this is frightening. And I remember the movies. Firefox, I think, was the name of one of the movies, and it was about the MiGs, and they're going ahead. We got spies here, spies there. We got Russian spies, we got American spies. And I'm telling you, I wake up with that nightmare daily. It was an awful time. I'm glad those days are now gone, I think.
The two countries had allied together during World War II, but that did not mean that they were on friendly terms. They were always competitive on who would be the biggest force. The Americans were trying to do away with communism, and the Soviet Union was a communist country, so they did not want the Americans to be meddling with their government. This war lasted for about 47 years.
The Cold War started in 1947 at the end of World War II. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies, but they had a very tense relationship. America was always wary towards Soviet communism and also the Russian leader Joseph Stalin's rule over his country, while the Soviets resented the fact that the United States had a delayed entry into the war because this resulted in deaths of tens of millions of Russian soldiers. After the war, the tension had only increased due to the Soviets' action in Eastern Europe. Many Americans feared a Russian plan that involved them controlling the world.
Propaganda had many effects on the Cold War. The propaganda portrayed the Soviet Union very negatively, while the United States was portrayed as a strong country. This made the Americans feel safer and less worried about the Cold War. In the United States, American politicians encouraged the making of nuclear weapons similar to the ones used to end World War II. This in fact motivated Russia to advance with the United States and become a larger, more powerful atomic nation than its enemy, the US. This in response led to Russia's first atomic bomb testing in 1949. President Truman in response says that the US will create an even more destructive bomb than that of Russia's. The hydrogen bomb that went off in the Marshall Islands created by the United States was named Ivy Mike. In 1952, the bomb went off, and over 60 years later, it is powerful enough to destroy half of Manhattan.
Father, Americans were more scared about a nuclear war because over time they found out through new bomb developments that these dangers could wipe out a large portion of the population. Worry spread as American citizens learned about the power and effects of atomic bombs. In 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, worry turned into fear and panic, causing many to be scared on a daily basis. The United States government made films to minimize people's fears that explained about atomic bombs and provided techniques to survive an atomic attack. Many Americans who feared the attack built bomb shelters to avoid the blast and extreme radiation.
The space race played a huge role in the events of the Cold War.
How did the space race impact the Cold War? The space race became the most important and key part of the competition of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, America became envious. This increased the tension between the two nations. When the Russians launched Sputnik, the world was also shocked due to many things that the Soviet Union was technologically behind. The biggest influence the Cold War had was the development of the intercontinental ballistic missile. This type of missile is designed to be launched to a high altitude, then fall on a specific target. There were many events that occurred during the Cold War. The first major event to occur was the Marshall Plan. This is when America gave $13 billion of economic support to help rebuild the European countries after World War II. The Berlin airlift took place the same year as the Marshall Plan, both in 1948. The Berlin airlift was one of the first major international crises of war. The Bay of Pigs was also another substantial event that occurred in April of 1961. This was an invasion by the United States military on Cuba. The invasion was a fail to the Americans. The U.S. was trying to overthrow Cuba's government in this invasion. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to separate East and West Berlin. This wall showed how the United States and the Soviet Union differed from each other, not only in their governments, but in the way the people of the countries worked. The wall symbolized the differences between the two. 27 years later, in 1989, the wall was destroyed. The Berlin Wall was destroyed because the East Berlin Communist Party announced a change in his city's relations with the West. That day, at midnight, people began destroying the wall. The weekend after the Berlin Wall was destroyed, more than 2 million people visited the other side to participate in this celebration. 3 years later, the Soviet Union failed.
So geht es zum Bruch und nichts anderes.
The Cold War ended in 1989 when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. In 1972, the two nations signed the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, which prohibited the making of nuclear missiles by both countries. Years later, the Soviet Union became affected by severe economic problems. In November 1989, when all the governments were changing, the Berlin Wall, which is the most visible symbol of the war, was finally destroyed. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself had fallen apart. The idea of a communist leader taking over the whole world failed. Even though this idea may have ended, the tension between the two countries is still present to this day. During the Cold War, the two nations were always trying to one-up each other, which led to more advanced technology. Due to this, our technology is able to be so advanced to this day. Since the Cold War, education in the United States has also never been better. The Americans learned that the more you put into education, the more you get out of the citizens. Thanks to the Cold War, technology and education has been advancing ever since.
We have agreed to eliminate the world's most dangerous weapons, heavy ICBMs, and all other multiple warhead ICBMs, and dramatically reduce our total strategic nuclear weapons. Certainly, I agree with what President Yeltsin said, that there is no animosity. The Cold War days are over, and he came here in a spirit of forward movement on these arms control agreements, and that speaks for itself.